Welcome to another episode of Red and Black, where your conservatism is not just the color that you're used to. I'm Lenny McAllister, and if you're watching this show, that probably means that your March Madness bracket has been busted, which makes you the majority of the rest of Americans. So, don't feel bad. But I'm going to bring you in with three friends that I don't know if their brackets have been busted or if they've been paying attention to the March Madness that I'm referring to. Jeff Charles, you down below. You're from California, you live in Texas. When I say March Madness, do you think I'm referring to what's going on in Ukraine or some basketball? Or both?
You know, what's surprising is that I know you're talking about some type of sport because I don't pay attention to sports at all. And I always forget what March Madness means. But I mean, but since I'm a little bit more cultured, I prefer to refer to the Ides of March, like Shakespeare, Yeah, that's right. So but there is craziness going on in Ukraine. And speaking of the Ides of March, there might be a chance that Putin might, kind of emulate Julius Caesar, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Let me start with another opening. Hello, I'm Lenny McAllister, and if you can relate to this Ides of March stuff and other stuff that they're talking about versus March Madness and a basketball, you, like these folks here, are probably a nerd. But that's okay. We love nerds here on Red and Black because nerds make all the money in the world. That's just kind of the little secret they don't tell you in your teenage years, but you find out once you grow up, right, Dr. Metzler?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you see my nerd glasses?
They cost $1,000, and they can see it in the future.
At least.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the March Madness in New York City today was, of course, St. Patrick's Day. This was the opportunity for a number of straight men to wear skirts. So there's that.
Hey, there is nothing wrong with that, boyo. Wait, you're not even talking about the right one. That's Scottish. It's the Scottish that wear the skirts. The Irish won't.
Well, I thought it was a good way to celebrate today because I did my ancestry DNA and there was a little bit of percentage of Ireland in there. So I'm feeling like this is my all-inclusive holiday. So I'm gonna roll with it.
Go with it.
Yeah.
Good.
Let me guess, you also got a little bit of Native American in you too. You're a little bit of Cherokee. That's what black people say. Black people are Irish on St. Patrick's Day, and this is coming from a guy that's last name is McAllister. And the other thing is that everybody's a little bit, Cherokee.
All my life, I thought I had a little bit of Indian, but when I got Native American, I got my ancestry DNA and there was 0 Native American. Sorry. So I was lied to all my life, like maybe some specific Democrat candidate that ran for president, who thought she was a little bit Native.
You're probably still more Native than she is.
Yeah, I would think so.
Mitt Romney is more Native than she is.
Agreed.
We're 4 minutes into the show, and we've already said the word Democrat. So if you're playing word bingo on Red and Black today, I haven't said I digress yet. Well, until I just said I digress. But we've already said Democrat. So there's that. Let's get into a little bit of March Madness that's not involving an orange round ball, but is involving a certain mile radius around Kiev in Ukraine and what's going on recently. And Dr. Metzler, I'm going to go to you once again because you're the world traveler. With what's been going on over this past week, we're hearing more grumbling from within Russia, including somebody being bold enough to go on a live broadcast and put up an anti-war message on a state-owned and state-run television station in Russia, which, because it was high profile, they're not going to do as much to her as they may even be doing to Brittany Griner at this point in time. But with that said, you're seeing this play in a different way that I think Vladimir Putin was expecting. Ukraine didn't fall anywhere near as fast as he thought it might. You're getting more protests from within Russia, which the West is able to use as propaganda. And we're now going into weeks upon weeks of a war that he thought would only last days upon days with, in essence, shock and awe of the 21st century.
Well, yeah. And first of all, it's actually Kyiv. But
yeah, and that's an interesting point because Kiev is the Russian deviation of it. Kyiv
Exactly.
is what Ukrainians call it, and
Right.
that's part of the battle between being independent and being part of still being underneath the Russian, or dare I say, Soviet shadow. Because again, you remember, it wasn't that long ago people were still calling it the Ukraine,
Yes.
which is, when it's the Ukraine, it's the Ukraine, i.e., as part of the USSR, versus Ukraine, a sovereign country.
Yeah. So
They
a
both
couple of
eat
things.
chicken Keith.
Yeah, chicken Keith. So a couple of things about that. First of all, clearly, for Vlad, the entire thing has not gone as he expected it to go. That's number one. Number two, it's interesting to me that people have not talked. Everyone is talking about how brilliant that the president of Ukraine's efforts are, his PR, etc. You think he's doing it alone? No, actually, he has got one of the top PR people in the world who, before this entire thing, was their lawyer and lobbyist on the pipeline. So once they decided that, Biden said, okay, no more pipeline, he switched then almost immediately to all of the social media, the messaging, and now he's a senior advisor to the president. And so part of what you're seeing here is not only a ground offensive, but a master use of social and other media with very high level government contacts. And so, Russia does not have the ability to do that, as they are isolated from the rest of the world. And plus, the propaganda machine won't work as effectively.
Stephanie, when you start thinking about that, Russia's trying to cut themselves off from the world internet, which makes them very much like China. And they've now reached out to China asking for help. But one of the ways that China can't help Russia is with trying to win the narrative of this aggressive action on Twitter, on TikTok, which ironically enough is owned by the Chinese, and on other social media platforms, where it doesn't matter how much you're shelling somebody in the short term, in the long term, Russia's not setting itself up for success, especially in the court of public opinion around the world.
Yeah, you know what? It seems like Putin is still using, Cold War era propaganda tactics. It worked back then, but it's not working now. I mean, it does have a level of efficacy, but we're still seeing that Russians are still getting this information. They're using VPNs, even though it's risky. They can use VPNs to still get into the outside world, see what's going on. A lot of them have relatives in Ukraine, so they're getting the real scoop there. As a matter of fact, one of my mom's friends, we talked to him this past weekend. He's a Russian Jew, originally from Russia, but he lived in Ukraine for 7 years. But he lived there under the Soviet Union. He's in the U.S. now, but he's still got relatives. He's got people in Ukraine who are telling him exactly what's going on. He says that a lot of the media is blacked out when he tries to listen to it. But there are still websites that are reporting on it. There are still, Ukraine and Russian language sites that are reporting on it. So the information is getting in there anyway. And when it comes to the overall international information war, I don't think the Kremlin was ready to fight that war. Ukraine was, and their persuasion game is on point to the extent that it's frustrating people who don't want us to help Ukraine. And now I think a lot of them are overreacting, but it does show when it comes to the information battle, the Ukraine is far better equipped than Moscow.
Priscilla, when it comes to this, though, it's kind of easy to get people to get on your side when you're the underdog, right? I mean, if this was a equal fight, it'd be a lot easier for Russia to be like, but the neo-Nazis, When you are the aggressor, and Ukraine is in the position that you're in, it's hard to mess this up. I mean, you have Zelensky that is there giving speeches still on the ground in the Capitol while they're shelling all around him. It's very easy to come across as patriotic and brave and win global support.
It's amazing the level of intensity that has increased from day to day like you said, when you have Zelensky giving this heart-wrenching presentation to Congress and showing the videos and the images of civilians and children being killed and pleading for no-fly zones and support, you've got NATO and the U.S. having these conversations about what to do next, because Putin's not going to stop until he gets Ukraine. I mean, his ego's in the way. That the time for negotiations has passed. It was ineffective when the vice president went to Europe. That was the opportunity to keep this from happening, but it's getting more and more intense. And so now the world has to decide, are they going to go into Ukraine and be a force against Putin, or are they going to allow Ukraine to fall to his hands? And so that is the conversation that the world is going to have in order to decide what the next steps are going to be. But I don't see Putin stopping what he's doing, regardless of his propaganda tactics. We just lost 2 American reporters on the ground, lost their lives to this. It's just insane. And so our president doesn't have the strength, unfortunately, to stop this. And I think Putin is wanting to see that, or would probably respond to the strength of the U.S., but I don't think we have that to offer him.
Well, but I think that he's more important than that. He is responding to the strength of Zelensky. Listen, did you all notice that, in fact, his PR machine is so fantastic? He had CNN in the room with some soldiers, some captured Russian soldiers today, so that CNN could verify that, in fact, they were not being fed lines and that it's genuine. It is that kind of stuff that we're talking about here. And of course, Putin's not going to be able to do that. But again, this is not a one-off. And so from his perspective, yeah, he is both the messenger and he is the message. So for all intents and purposes, in winning the PR war and in winning what ultimately will be the outcome has nothing to do with Biden. It is the message and the messenger. It is Zelensky who is going to win this battle.
It goes to this, Jeff. Go right ahead, because I have a question, but go right ahead.
And I kind of wonder, just really quick, I mean, I do think that there's a chance that Putin might not win this, and that maybe if he's given an offer, he'll take it. But there's also the possibility that he wins, but it's not really a win. I mean, this could totally be a Pyrrhic victory, like a victory that costs more than it's worth. So even if he wins, Putin might still lose.
And that's actually what I wanted to ask you, Jeff. It's amazing.
I read your mind. The force is strong with us.
Well, or I'm not that hard to read. Anyway, I'm not that complicated of a guy. Question is, when has been redefined? And Zelensky in the PR battles, and what you're seeing in the Western world, the media, and the protest in Russia, Jeff, I'm going to start with you first. It seems as though the definition of win for Russia and even for Ukraine has changed because, among other things, maybe win is no longer total control and total puppetry of Ukraine as a country, as a satellite, 21st century satellite of Moscow. Maybe win becomes, you get these 2 breakaway republics, we keep our country, and now we decide 5 years later we're going to join NATO, or these NATO countries, which ironically enough, Donald Trump was saying, you all aren't paying your bill, we're out. These countries now say, I don't want to admit that Donald Trump was right, but we haven't been paying our bill, and we saw what happened, and so we're going to ante up. And maybe now Putin gets a stronger NATO to deal with as a result of what he's doing, which would be much more of a win for the West and Ukraine than initially thought just 2 months ago.
Well, yeah, and that's why I've been saying I think it is very possible. And I think at this point it's beyond possible. I think it happened. Whether he ends up getting Ukraine or not, Putin has calculated this. Like he did, and I'm surprised that he did because he's very shrewd. He's very intelligent. He's ruthless. But he knows what's going on. So it's kind of surprising to see this turn out the way it has. And I do think that either way, whether Putin loses or wins, he still loses. Like I don't see him coming out of this in a way that's favorable to him. Even if he wins, he's got the populace against him. They may not be able to say it the way you and I can, but I wouldn't be surprised if he gets ousted, whether it's by assassination or by a coup or by whatever. I mean, it is very possible to me that the Russian public, including the oligarchs, including the elites, have lost faith in him. So I think he gambled, and I don't think he won in this.
Well, I mean, I think it's very difficult for Zelensky to protect his country from airstrikes. That's where we're at. He did mention that he would potentially give up his desire to join NATO as a negotiation tool. We'll see if that's true or not, but I don't see how he wins the actual war. And I don't know how long the rest of the other NATO countries are going to sit back and allow Zelensky to flounder without having military ammunition against fighting, Putin. I just don't see that happening.
Well, look at
Here's the question, though, for you three. It's does Ukraine have to join NATO now? Because the truth is, now that you've seen what Putin will do, NATO can strengthen itself and say, and we already have a vested interest in border countries to the western part of Russia, including Ukraine, and they don't necessarily even have to join that alliance anymore, which is almost the beauty of this. Putin tried to go after Ukraine because Ukraine was flirting with NATO, and now NATO doesn't even have to join it. It can literally be, Dr. Metzler, part of the negotiating tactic, negotiating terms. Yeah, we won't join NATO, but NATO will sit there and say, it doesn't matter if Ukraine joins or not, because we're going to have Ukraine's back after what happened in 2022. And that could be something that's generational.
Well, so a couple of things. One, both Putin and Zelensky have been moving the goalposts. The thing about we are not now going to join NATO. Okay, here's what folks don't understand. They're not ready to join NATO. They will be ready in about 5 to 7 years. He never said we will never join NATO. What he said is we are not now going to join NATO. So that's number one in terms of moving the goalposts. In terms of, victory, well, what does that look like? It can look like whatever they say that it's going to look like. So I think it's important to look at that as well. They are both moving the goalposts.
But with Ukraine, though, even if Zelensky signed something that said Ukraine will not join NATO for 25 years, all the rebuilding that's going to happen in Ukraine, who's going to be over the rebuilding? It's going to be American contractors, British contractors, German contractors. And when you have those business interests in that country and in those regions, what else are you going to have? A military presence, which is going to bring in what? Likely not just those countries individually, but also NATO in some capacity. Ukraine doesn't even need to be a member of NATO, probably in the foreseeable future, if this plays out the way it could play out.
But they don't need to be. Absolutely. They don't need to be. The question, though, is legitimacy and presence on the world stage. They're then going to stick it in his face. Yeah, we said, and they can sign whatever they want. Good luck enforcing it. It is not enforceable. So at the end of the day, they end up winning. And so, yeah, he can, bomb the city and all of that kind of stuff. And here's another thing that we're not really paying attention to. Part of the reason that he did so poorly with the military, something like 85% of the military he had on the ground are conscripts. So they were taking in as a member of the draft. They can't fight. That's not what they do. They were told you've turned whatever the age is, you need to go to war. Here's the other thing. Body bags are going to start coming home. Mothers are going to start saying, where are my children? And what is he going to do now? Do more conscripts? And I'm sorry, they're okay. We're going to have the Syrians come and join us and fight. How did that work out for them last time? And so you're going to bring them to fight these guerrilla warfare experts? Come on, this is laughable. And that's a large part. At the end of the day, the ultimate victor in this case is Zelensky. He's not. So yeah, he's bombed the place, all of that kind of stuff. Look at how much money they're going to get to rebuild it. Look at the economic powerhouse that it's going to become. So I think we have to look at it that broadly.
Let me ask this question to all three of you. Jeff, I'll start with you. Where is the red line? Because Priscilla brought up a good point. We're still not going to have a no-fly zone. And Putin, and to Jeff's point earlier, as far as, Putin miscalculated a lot of this, and he did. There are certain things he didn't miscalculate, which include the Americans are not running in here.
Yep.
They're not going to put their airplanes in the sky. NATO's not going to do it so much because they don't want a world war. So if I threaten a nuclear weaponry, they'll back off. They know what the consequences are. However, there still has to be a red line somewhere. Is that red line more attacks in the western part of Ukraine, where now you are getting close to the Polish border or other countries? Do we start thinking about that as the red line? What is the established red line, if there is one? And I asked that because, again, I talked about last week how this war was started not from 2022 or even from 2015. It started with the red line in Syria. It's ironic Dr. Metzer would bring it up. That red line in Syria was not enforced by the Americans a decade ago. Putin learned that lesson. We can't draw another red line and have that not be enforced either, because if that's the case, you will see the Chinese go into Taiwan. You will see other bad actors around the world really be bad actors, as if they need any other excuse.
Yeah, which is why there will be no red line. Biden is not going to lay out a red line. I can't even blame that all on Biden. I don't think America wants him to lay out a red line. I don't think America, under any circumstances, wants to send U.S. troops over there. I think even the most hawkish of us don't want to do it. Yeah, there's a few, but in general, I mean, we're not going to do anything. So it's really not even much of a conversation, because it's just, I'll just say this: I'll be shocked if it happens. If Biden lays out a red line, I don't even know what that would be. I don't. That's not going to happen. We're not going to be sending a single troop over there to fight in this war. Or if it does, it's going to be against the will of the American public, which would be a horrible idea for Democrats right now, because they're already in a very precarious situation.
Priscilla, what's the red line, if there is one?
I think that's a great question. When I was watching Zelensky's speech, it's evident that he's a president who loves his country and is standing. He's not fled. He's standing strong. But he used a word multiple times, and that word is peace. And he has a responsibility on his shoulders to end the massacres that are happening with the children and the women and the civilians in his country. When you look at those images, I mean, just recently, a theater full of civilians was shot, and he can't let that continue to happen. So he's going to have to make a very difficult decision to figure out where his red line is. When is he going to negotiate and give Putin what he wants? He's going to have to sit down with Putin and say, what is it that you want in order to stop this war? And that's going to be the difficult thing. But I don't see Putin stopping. The type of mentality that Putin has, he wants all or nothing. And so I think that's why we're seeing such an increase in activity in the the eastern part of the country.
As we're talking about Zelensky and red lines, and Zelensky trying to cajole the U.S. Congress to get more involved. I mean, you could see how hard he was trying. Look, he literally tried to connect what's going on in Ukraine with "I Have a Dream" in his speech, which I was like, okay, this was obviously written by a Ukrainian that doesn't know much about American history, because people are just going to be like, I don't see how Dr. Martin Luther King is involved in Cold War politics, because it does that he's not going to be on the right side of cajoling Americans to do something about this. But with that said, he was trying to draw a red line for the Americans that nobody really bid on. So to Jeff's point, maybe even the Priscilla's point, is there a red line? Which, if there's not a red line, isn't that dangerous too?
Well, but pay attention to what his chief of staff said. Chief of staff said, "We don't need you," and he said that today. "We don't need you to protect our skies. Just give us the air equipment and we'll do it ourselves." That's part of what he said today. Now, there is, at this point, there is no red line. However, you hear NATO starting to hint at what they think is a red line, which is to the extent that he uses chemical warfare, then that is the red line. So you've heard that conversation already going on. Secondly, they've been saying you get any closer to a NATO member and we will respond. Biden's not going to set any kind of red line because he doesn't have the political support at home to do this. In a case like this, he can't just do this alone. He is going to need to get authorization from the Congress, which then puts a whole political turmoil given the midterms and given 2024. So there are all of those things to consider as well. There is no red line that Biden's going to set. To the extent that there is a red line, and I don't think there is, you will start seeing NATO doing that. And that's why they started now talking about chemical warfare. And that is what they're saying is going to be the red line.
So let me go to this, because you all have brought up the politics here in the United States in regards to drawing the red line or the failure or intentionality of not drawing a red line. And Jeff, I'm going to go to you first because you brought up Democrats, which again, I don't know if this is a Republican or Democrat issue, but it does kind of lead to what I'm thinking, which is simply this. You know, there's not too many things that unite this country anymore. Even watching bloodshed, even watching innocent children lose their lives, even against somebody that, or a country that has been for probably the last 3 to 4 generations, been at the very, very best a frenemy, and at the very, very worst, the country we feared that would blow up the world, that we hated in everything from hockey to, you know, Drago in a make-believe movie, and yet we can't even get Fox News hosts and others to kind of get on the same page with that. Is there anything that would unite Americans to go to war? Because even when we talk about 9/11, there was unity right after 9/11, and then there wasn't before we knew it.
You know, it's funny. I've been pondering that question myself. I actually plan to write an article about it, but honestly, I mean, we are united. We don't want to go to war. I mean, Democrat and Republican agree. I think at this point, the only thing that could push us to go to war is for somebody to attack us on our home soil, whether it's even if it, like whether it's a Pearl Harbor type of situation or if they pull off some type of terrorist attack. I mean, because that's the other thing. It's very hard to invade the United States, not just because of our military, but also because of geography. But it's going to take something like that. Like a country is going to have to do something directly to America, and I believe on American soil, for us to get united behind the idea of going to war. That's not likely to happen.
If Vladimir Putin, throwing this question out to the three of you, initiates a cyber attack that causes the American banking system to be disrupted for 36 hours, which would cost us billions upon billions of dollars for a disruption for 36 hours. Do we go to a physical confrontation with Russia at that point in time?
No.
If the Russians,
they're going to have to kill people.
If a Russian cell of, if Russian-born terrorists do a repeat of what we saw in Boston with the Boston Marathon, do we get into a physical confrontation with the Russians? Because remember, those two kids were Russian-born terrorists. If the same exact thing happens, and now we have this going on in Ukraine, do we get a physical confrontation with Russia?
Only, I would say only if they can prove that it was ordered by the Kremlin. If they can't prove that, we're not doing anything.
Well, remember, we have a president that believes in diplomacy. That's all Jen Psaki talks about. We're just going to have conversations, and we're going to bring in the counselors. We're just going to see, hold hands and talk about it.
Yeah, but we got all kind of Congress people and senators, which means that we have one president and about 300 people that are going to be president one day, if you listen to them and their camps. So we know that's not going to be the only narrative that's out there. And you see what I'm doing. I'm trying to emphasize the point that we are really, really divided. And if there's ever a time to attack America, it would be right now, because, I mean, if you're Vladimir Putin, there's got to be things that you think that you can get away with that the Americans wouldn't still push back on you on, or at least not in a very bad way. We're crushing them economically with sanctions as it is. If he did some type of cyber attack, we found out that, 3 states in the plains ended up not having electricity for 3 days because of a disrupt. That's exactly what would happen, what Dr. Metzler's doing. Even though it would be an attack on an American electrical grid, the reaction would be the same shrug that Dr. Metzler's having. Is that not something we should be thinking about, saying, okay, man, I can't see Reagan having that reaction. I can't see any American having that reaction in 1983, for example. But we would now.
No, absolutely not. Look, unless there is blood involved, now, if you're going to fly some planes back into the new Twin Towers, okay. But other than something major like that, it's just not going to happen. And see, here's the thing. You have some Republicans now who are pretending to be overly hawkish. They're not. They're doves. It ain't going to happen. And so all of
these
this
presidential candidates, Dr. Metzler?
Yeah.
Okay.
and it's not going to happen. We don't want to see the suffering. We don't want to do that, but we don't want to sacrifice American lives. A cyber attack, okay, yeah, whatever. That's, so yeah, I was inconvenienced for a couple of days. Cyber attack them back. That's going to be the response. That's not sufficient.
Priscilla, do you think that we're at this point in time? And this just came to mind, and I know that you're in Colorado, so Columbine is close to everybody's heart out there in Colorado. But in the Boulder State, my question becomes: do you think that because we've gone through 25 years of like mass shootings and different types of really traumatic things domestically, that it would take an awful lot, that the bar has been raised that much higher because we've gone through those things and been desensitized? So even if there was a terroristic attack that may have come from a Russian cell that kills 15 people, we would not have the same level of angst that maybe we would have in 1987 if this would happen, because we've been through Columbine, we've been through all these different incidences, we've been through Aurora, unfortunately another situation out in Colorado, we've been through the shooting in Florida, we've been through the Gabby Gifford shooting, and we've seen those things and we've lived through it. So our threshold of sensitivity has been lowered. Do you think that might be playing into what we're seeing as well?
Well, I personally don't think that Americans have become desensitized to that type of tragedy. I think people respond in great ways when they see injustice happening. But what I do think is that people are more prepared and have the tools to handle tragedies a little bit better. And if something were to happen, I believe that Americans have a resolve in order to respond. Unfortunately, you're right that these types of tragedies that you're describing have happened too often. But that's why you're seeing a lot of mobilization and activation amongst the base in the conservative world, and maybe even moderates, to say, hey, we don't want to be caught unprepared for a tragedy. We want to be able to respond in a way that unites us and keeps us strong. And so that would be my perspective on what could potentially happen. I think people are going to be a little bit more prepared, not necessarily desensitized.
One thing I want to point out too is that even when we're talking about our red line, like what would make the America go to war, I think we also need to take into effect that it's not just the fact that we don't want to risk American lives unless it's absolutely necessary. I think that over the past 2 decades, a lot of Americans, myself included, have become disenchanted with the idea that American military force ends up with a positive outcome. We've seen that it doesn't. And then that caused us to even look back and see, well, when have we actually intervened militarily and it turned out good? There's not a lot of examples, especially when it concerns the Middle East. I mean, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and didn't accomplish much of anything. We should have left soon after we did what we needed to do. Same thing with Iraq. I mean, we don't believe in the whole nation building thing anymore, and I don't think we will again for a long time. I think we'll all be on this panel. We'll all be long dead and gone before we get back to that point.
Yeah.
So I think there's also that. It's not just the fact that we don't want to risk American lives. We know that it's not likely that a whole lot of good will come of it. So I think that is the only way we would go to war is if somebody came to our soil and killed Americans. That's it.
Let me go to presidential scholar, official red and black presidential scholar, Dr. Christopher J. Metzler. Dr. Metzler, do you think that attitude that Jeff is referring to perhaps boils down to a little bit of misuse or maybe even some braggadocious over recent presidencies where Clinton kind of misused the military as a distraction? Some would argue back in the 1990s that George W. Bush kind of misguided the U.S. military towards Iraq when the goal was supposed to be Osama bin Laden. People would make that argument. Jeff's point about being in Afghanistan as long as we were. I mean, you can go all the way back to Vietnam, and people would make the argument that if there have been misuses of the American military by presidents for a variety of reasons, but it's whittled away the confidence that Americans now have in the military and even how we view the military. It took one hell of a PR campaign well over a decade to get people to start thinking of the military with a high level of honor and respect after Vietnam and even during much of the Cold War.
Well, that's correct. I mean, we only recently started thanking soldiers for their service. I mean, come on, let's be very clear about this. And also, let's look at Obama as we're talking about that conversation. Yeah, so when Putin went in the first time, don't cross this red line, boy. He did. And what happened? Absolutely nothing. Look, at the end of the day, we are not, it is this notion that, and first of all, Congress and the president are a lot to blame relative to this. Because in fact, Congress said to the president, you can go to work, you can use you use the military, you don't really have to talk to us. So the president makes decisions like that entire withdrawal from Afghanistan. Why wasn't Congress consulted from the beginning relative to that? Guess what? Because they gave up the opportunity to be consulted. So the president simply decides, okay, I don't need to come to you with this. And so this abdication of leadership from both parties is part of the reason why we are where we are now.
Let's talk about people doing things and abusing things and making a mess of things that people are not taking a stab at, or I hate to even use that word considering the story, or an angle on, and that's the whole Jussie Smollett and coming out of jail and the appeal and this, that, and the other. And I know that people are going to talk about the whole situation, but here's the angle I want to go after, and I'm going to start with you, Priscilla. When you give this high level of a fake story, all the way to the point where you force the DA to have to prosecute you and throw you in jail to make an example of you during a time where racial tensions are extremely high, where we still have Ahmaud Arbery, among other stories out there. Am I wrong in thinking that people are ignoring the fact that this is the type of stuff that makes race relations a lot worse? Because, I mean, I just read a story where we have literally somebody on a school board in Norwin, Pennsylvania, that does not want to have critical race theory, the boogeyman, taught in Norwin schools because systemic racism is a myth after 1965.
Well,
And so when you have situations like the Smollett case, you end up getting, in one weird way or another, it leads to that type of comment because it just confounds everything.
it shows how demented some people are, where they think that it's appropriate to fake their own hate crimes. I went back and I rewatched his interview and the tears, and he's such a good actor. And the extent to which he even accused white people in saying MAGA and using the N-word. And there are people still defending his behavior. And I think that it's just really telling in this day and age. We need to have a conversation within our own community about what it is we want, because we can't embarrass ourselves like this. We can't get any traction to move forward and get away from CRT and true systemic racism in our country when you have people going around saying the sky is falling. We can't believe him. I have no faith in some people in our community. And when you have so-called Black leaders in our community still defending him and believing his lie, and he's saying I'm not suicidal, and he doesn't eat for a week, and he does this hunger strike, and they're talking about putting him in a mental hospital. Like, that is mental. What he did, that's not someone who's sane. And so I think that the courts did what they had to do. The appeal has to go the way it went. You can't, from what I understand, and Dr. Metzler, you're the attorney, about you can't try someone twice.
For presidential historian, don't forget the presidential
historian and mentor and extraordinaire and connoisseur of food. So it's just such a sad thing to see. He ruined his life, he ruined his career, and he brought all of these demographics into the hate crimes that came to him. I mean, just the destruction. He threw a grenade in the room and he shut the door, and he has no remorse for what he did.
But Dr. Metzler, he did more than that. The argument I'm trying to make, and maybe it's not an argument that's there, is he didn't just throw a grenade. He lifted a bomb and threw it into a room, and it's going to blow up a room that's already been blown up by other bombs and other grenades over the last 15 years. Look, Ferguson was not that long ago. Trayvon Martin was only 10 years ago. Lest we forget George Floyd, which is both 2 years ago and felt like yesterday and felt like 20 years ago. And then this type of thing comes up. There's going to be, as far as I'm saying, and I could be wrong, I want your opinion, obviously, there could be collateral damage from this type of story going on and on. The more we see it, it's going to be a pendulum going both ways. There's going to be some people that are going to see racism everywhere still. And then you're going to have some people that are going to go out there and say racism was eliminated with the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. There hasn't been systemic racism since 1965.
Well, I mean, look, on the racism piece, on the dumb piece, on the acting piece, all of those kinds of things, this is absolutely a shame. Here's the problem we had with this case from the very beginning. So Kim Foxx, who was the DA and who had conversations with him, advising him as to what to do, she was supposed to be the one prosecuting. So the case was tainted from the beginning. That's number one. Number two, the judge in this case, when he was making the sentencing, he made an egregious error. He had to, given his background, given that he had not committed any crimes, he had to release him from jail pending his appeal. That's the law. It's plain and simple. And instead, the judge then goes on this tirade. And it's fine. You can go on the tirade. Judge has the absolute right to do that. So what ends up happening now is he's released. His appeal will probably take 2 to 3 years. And guess what? Despite all of the nonsense, despite the fact that he has taken us back for so long, despite the fact that his story was so unbelievable, Sit your ass down someplace. I mean, he is in a high rent district in Chicago. Two random white people with MAGA hats appeared in that district. I mean, come on. And of course, immediately they jumped to he is guilty. So on both sides, the judge had no choice. He had to release him pending appeal. That's the situation here. But this is absolutely, there is no way he should have done any of this and expected, a high degree of protection. Oh, and by the way, if you've seen Chris Cuomo's lawsuit, part of what he said in that lawsuit was, oh, by the way, I was treated differently than Don Lemon. Because as y'all know, Don spoke to Jesse as a journalist, and he was never, ever really sanctioned or punished for that. So and part of this too is we are putting too much faith in these so-called celebrities who are just absolute psychos. Rather than worrying about all that stuff, he need to check himself into a mental institution because he cray-cray.
Let's just break that down a little bit more if we can, because there is a double standard that once again you do have Don Lemon. And Don Lemon, look, ever since Don Lemon broke away from what they used to indoctrinate, so they used to call it this. They used to call it the ghetto, which the CNN weekend was, because that's where they had all the black hosts by and large. Once he broke away from that, and you stopped. Your friend Jessica Whitfield, who was great, she's still there, but T.J. Holmes is no longer there. Suzanne Malveaux is no longer there by and large. Soledad O'Brien is no longer there. Roland Martin, who used to be on CNN, is no longer there. And Don kind of got that platform. He's kind of really shifted some of the things. He's bent some rules. He has done some things. And his role in this situation is not good as well either. Jeff, I just look at this and I say, this is the ongoing evolution of the racial problems that we have, that I still say Barack Obama brought to us, not because he's responsible for them, but because he was a lens to say, you want to know how you feel about racism in America right now? You want to know where we are with race relations in America? I'm now the first black president. How do you feel? And some people were like, I don't care. You went to Harvard. I mean, you're a Chicago politician. You work the system. Other people lost their minds. But number two, and this is something that other people also aren't talking about, Jeff, which is black people that go through real racism, the last thing they want to do is bring up racism. Because if you bring up racism in a false way, this is where it goes. Right. One, you get caught. And two, people act like racism doesn't exist anymore, which is why people that have gone through real racism hate when people talk about the race card, because they're like, are you effing kidding me? There is no race card. There's either racism or there's not racism. Don't play me with this. And then you have this case come up that only justifies the very behavior that some people are trying to eradicate on both sides of the race relations time.
Yeah, see, now it's you reading my mind, because that's kind of where I was going to go with this. I mean, there was a time, and I still think that most black people do this, but you see somebody like Jussie and what they did, and we look at that and we say, man, that just set us back 50 years. because that's essentially what he's doing. To see these black leaders or high profile, I'm going to hold the language back, but these high profile black folks actually defending him is infuriating. Like, this is wrong. No, you don't defend him. You throw his ass under the bus where he belongs.
Right. Well, you leave it be. Even if you don't throw him underneath the bus,
I would take that. I would take that too, Lenny. Like, if you don't have anything constructive to say, then just shut the hell up. Because what he did was wrong. There is no spinning it. There is no making it sound like the punishment is worse than the crime. No, he deserves to be punished for the exact same reason that you just said. We already have enough. I mean, I'm a conservative. I'm on the right, so I'm very much aware of this. That there are a lot of people out there who want to deny that racism exists, and Jesse just gave the man ammo. Oh, if America's so racist, why did he have to fake a hate crime? I'm like, you know what? You're wrong, but at the same time,
you did that twice, by the way. That was so good. I bet you can do that twice.
Replicate that again.
Okay, keep going.
It has to be spontaneous. But I'm like, okay, you're wrong, but at the same time, Jesse gave you that ammo. We should all be pissed off at him. You can have compassion and still be angry at him. What he did was wrong, and it was destructive. It didn't just hurt him. It hurt a lot of different people, so that now when something actually does happen, people will just think it's fake. And it's funny because a lot of conservatives think that most hate crimes are hoaxes. That's not true. Now, if you're talking about the ones who make national news, then now you got a point. But if you look at the FBI database, hate crimes do happen. They're nowhere near as common as other crimes. So I'm not trying to over-exaggerate the prevalence of hate crimes. I'm just saying they do happen, and there are far more legitimate cases than there are hoaxes. But again, you're not going to know that because people like Jesse take the spotlight for their own personal reasons because he's a nut job and actually thought this was going to work. And no, we should not be defending this at all, ever. And I know there are a lot of Black people who vote Democrat who would agree with me on this. Unfortunately, they're not the ones who have the microphone.
Well, just think of the timing of all of this too, right before the presidential reelection. And so he had a plan to try to disrupt and derail President Trump's reelection bid by doing this. And of course, there were a lot of other things happening in the US around race relations. There's always been that tension. So I think he did a great disservice to the Black community by what he did, because now he's created distrust amongst people. Like, to Jeff's point, now when there's a real hate crime, people are going to question whether it's true or not. And I hope that people don't try to mimic him to make a point with it with midterms coming up. I mean, it's a lesson to all of us in propaganda right before an election. We're going to see all kinds of crazy things happen when people get desperate for their political point of view. But that's a great lesson for all of us. And like Jeff said, whether you're on the right or the left, we just can't stand up for bad behavior and people with lack of integrity. And we should question everything and hold people accountable, no matter what your political party view is.
Dr. Messer, I can't agree with them less. I can't agree with them more. I think they're 100% on point. This is going to have consequences. I mean, Priscilla, she brings it up so eloquently. You know, that Chicago vote for Donald Trump was really up in the air. I mean, the polling had it within 2 percentage points of whether or not Chicago was going to go Republican for the first time in, 100 years. So why would you do that at a crucial time? But, it also seems to be indicative of where we are as a society, because, you have him setting up this hate crime. You have the Kanye West intimidation of Kim Kardashian on social media to the point of time where they are suspending him on social media. And you're talking about, again, two people that are kind of quasi-married, but used to be married, but should be divorced. And one's trying to intimidate the other back into the marriage. And it's like, you're showing America all the things we thought we were past when we got to Y2K. We were worried about some computers. We weren't talking about domestic violence. We weren't talking about racism in the same terms. And these things are coming back to light, whether it's between police interactions and some of the deadly things that we have seen, or like the Walter Scott case in South Carolina, or the types of things that Kanye West are doing that people are like, oh, that's just he being ye. No, that's how people die. Maybe not Kanye West, but Kanye West is now talking about threatening D.L. Hughley and everything else. These are examples, and it's back to your point, Dr. Metzler. These are the celebrities. These are supposed to be the role models.
Well, therein lies the problem. Why do we need these so-called role models? Therein lies the problem. And so what are we trying to model? We are trying to model the story that they told us. That's what we're trying to model. And that is not who they are as people. And I think fundamentally, there is a fundamental disconnect between those higher echelon Black people And
He's trying to avoid a phrase.
and the rest of us. I mean, because what ends up happening is they're going around talking about, oh, well, no, Hollywood, we can't have that. No, free Jesse. Free him from what? Free him from what? From his madness? Free him from his lies, his deceit? Free him from what? Free him from the fact that he was trying to get more money from Empire, and so he created this hate crime? Free him from the fact that he sat on the stand and said he went to the bathhouse with these guys and one of them, and they had sex and they were smoking and all that. That's model behavior? No, it's not. But then you have the Hollywood set who are going out and just saying, no, we have to protect him. If you want to protect him, Baker Act him, put him in a psych ward, and let him do it.
And protect us. Protect the same people. Protect the same black
put him
people.
in there.
Legitimate concerns about racism. Don't protect him. I don't care about him.
And as we wrap up, because we're going to have to wrap up, that kind of goes back to the point. We talk about this in politics all the time. Special interest groups. And we get on both sides of the aisle for special interest groups. But even when it starts talking about public policy with something like this, and let's be honest, race relations is a public policy issue. Even with this, people are so caught up in special interest that they're not caught up in the truth. And that kind of only puts us back on a track that we don't need to be on, with inflation going through the roof, with a war going through Ukraine. And as Dr. Metzer likes to quote, the former gubernatorial candidate in New York, the rent's too damn high. With that said, Jeff, what are you working on this week?
I've got more interviews coming out. I had to reschedule some because I got sick with this stupid sinus infection, but now that it's going away and my voice is getting back to normal, I got more fire interviews on for YouTube, and I've actually got some more audio only podcasts coming out too.
Fantastic. Priscilla, what you got going this week? Anything exciting and new?
Yes, we have county assembly starting. We're starting to elect our candidates that are going to improve things here in Colorado and lower our taxes and make it affordable so we can drive our cars. So that's what we're going to do this weekend.
Fantastic. Dr. Metzer, what you got going on?
Well, working on a lecture at University of the Exchequer, talking about global politics and global positioning and why America is falling out of favor.
Listen, folks, like, subscribe, share Red and Black. I should have said at the beginning of the show. I should have said at the middle of the show. They're going to laugh.
Definitely not doing his job.
Yeah,
I know.
Exactly. Well, that is actually supposed to be job. But I'll take the blame for it this week. Like, subscribe, share. Make sure people are sharing it on their Facebook, their Instagram, their Twitter. Check us out every single week. Thank you once again for joining us this week. Keep yourself blessed. We'll catch up to you next week. TCNTB, y'all. Take care and God bless.
Yeah.
Bye.
Peace.